Bourbon has exploded in the last decade, bringing with it craft distilleries, scalpers, and that one over-oaked, overpriced bourbon that everybody wants. But what actually is bourbon whiskey, and why should you be drinking it? Here's everything you need to know about bourbon, including its history, how it's made, and some of the first brands to come to market. Let's start at the beginning. Bourbon has a pretty crazy history that dates back to the 18th century. It is believed that bourbon was first made by Scottish and Irish settlers who brought their whiskey-making skills to the American colonies. Bourbon's named after Bourbon County, Kentucky, which was founded in 1785 and was originally part of Virginia. It was named in honor of the French royal family who had provided military and financial assistance to the colonies during the Revolutionary War. Bourbon became popular in the 19th century, and by the 20th century it had become one of the most popular alcoholic beverages in the United States. However, you can't talk alcohol in the US without talking about Prohibition, but I'll keep it brief. Prohibition lasted from 1920 to 1933, and because of the nationwide ban on the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, many bourbon distilleries were forced to shut down. When that nightmare was over, you had a number of bourbon distilleries that were still around, but the reputation of bourbon had been tarnished by those that cut corners during Prohibition. This was what ultimately led to the Federal Standards of Identity for Distilled Spirits in 1964, which was a set of regulations designed to ensure that bourbon met certain standards in production and labeling. Next, let's talk about how bourbon's made. Bourbon is made from a grain mixture of at least 51% corn, along with other grains like rye, wheat, and barley. The grains are mashed and then fermented with yeast to produce a wash that contains alcohol. The wash is then distilled to create a clear, high-proof alcohol that is typically around 70% ABV. The clear alcohol is then aged in charred oak barrels, which give bourbon its distinctive flavor and color. The barrels must be new and charred on the inside, and they are typically made from American white oak. Bourbon must be aged for a minimum of 2 years to be considered straight bourbon, but many bourbons are aged for much longer than that. After the bourbon has been aged to the desired flavor profile, it is typically blended with other barrels to achieve a consistent flavor across batches. The bourbon is then bottled and sold. Some of the first brands of bourbon whiskey to come to market include Jim Beam, which was a brand that was introduced in 1795 and is one of the most well-known bourbon brands of the world. Old Forester is a brand that was introduced in 1870 and is still produced today. It's the oldest continuously produced bourbon brand in the United States thanks to a medical license granted by the government that allowed them to sell during Prohibition. Old Grandad, which is a brand that was introduced in 1882 and is named after Basil Hayden, who was a distiller and early pioneer of bourbon. Maker's Mark, which was a brand that was introduced in 1953 and is known for its distinctive red wax seal on the bottle. And Wild Turkey, which was a brand that was introduced in 1940 and is named after a bottle of whiskey brought along on a hunting trip. You can find much more information about bourbons, Irish, Scotches, and all other forms of whiskey on this channel, The Whiskey Dictionary. Cheers.